4-ingredient fresh bread in about 30 minutes. Can't beat that. Hi, I'm Judy Mateski, and I'm a registered dietitian with Athens Nutrition, as well as a culinary nutritionist, and I'm here today to talk about Irish soda bread. Very traditional. The recipe is great because it really is super simple. I feel like sometimes the Irish soda bread that we're more familiar with currants and butter and other additions, is more of an Americanized version of Irish soda bread, and the one we're making today is pretty traditional. 4 ingredients, and traditionally Irish soda bread does contain whole grain flour, which is fantastic because we always are looking for ways to increase the fiber and increase the nutrients in the food that we're eating. So we're going to be making that today. It's super quick, and then I'll show you the finished product that I baked earlier. It is literally 4 ingredients. So we're using flour, and I'm using a combination of white whole wheat flour. I just love the King Arthur brand. It's one of my favorites. I always keep my flour in the freezer, particularly whole grain flours, because they can tend to get rancid much more quickly than more of a processed white flour. So if you are using whole grain flours, I highly recommend storing them in a really good container. I found these containers actually off of the King Arthur website, so I keep these in my freezer, and it just really keeps my flour really fresh. All right, so when baking, and I'm not an expert baker by any means, but when baking, one of the greatest tools you can have is a scale, is a food scale, because rather than using measurements when baking, I just think it's so much better to use weight. You're more likely to come out with a much better product if you're actually weighing rather than measuring when it comes to flour and even sugar and things that could vary in their weight based on the volume. So this recipe is using equal parts white whole wheat or whole wheat flour as well as all-purpose flour. So I'm going to use, it's 250 grams, which is about 2 cups, but again, if you can weigh this, I would. I think that just is certainly better, especially when making bread. So I'm going to turn my scale on. I have it on for grams. So again, you can't go wrong when you're measuring because it's more of an exact science. And I think when it comes to cooking, baking really is more of a science than, so let me get this out. I went a little over. So 250 on the button. How about that? All right, same thing with the all-purpose flour. It's 250 grams. So I'm going to bring this up to a total of 500, so it's really accurate. And again, so this is a nice, traditionally Irish soda bread is a blend of wholemeal flour or whole grain flour. And let's see if I got it. There we go. All right, whole grain flour and all-purpose flour. I had tried it once with 100% whole grain flour, and it just is a little too dense, it gets a little too dry. So probably better to do the half and half. Now it's the baking soda. All right, so the baking soda is key here. So 1 teaspoon of baking soda. That's what's going to give this bread its rise, because we're not using yeast, we're not kneading it, we're not proofing it. Everything is coming from the interaction of the baking soda and the buttermilk, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So we are going to use a teaspoon of salt. Bread really does need sodium. Without it, it really is so limited in its flavor. So I would add the sodium, the salt. You could cut it down a little bit if you need to, but it's calling for 1 teaspoon. So I am just going to now just kind of blend this together a little bit, just so that the salt and the baking soda kind of gets incorporated into the flours, and the flours kind of come together. So let's just stir that around. Now I'm going to set this off to the side for a minute because let's do the buttermilk. Same thing, I am going to weigh it. This is calling for 400 milliliters of buttermilk, and that is, let me just change the units here to milliliters because it's on grams. And that is, oh gosh, maybe around 2 cups of buttermilk, but again, it's not exact. So, and buttermilk is such a great addition to, buttermilk is such a great addition to a lot of baked goods. It helps with giving it more of a tender crumb. It adds a little acidity. It is naturally low fat because buttermilk is made from what's left over after making butter. So, I mean, traditionally, that's what buttermilk is. So it's the whey, it's everything that's left over after making butter. But now it's not typically made that way. I mean, buttermilk is there's a culture added to the buttermilk, so that turns it into buttermilk rather than using the leftovers from butter. So we're going to use 400 milliliters of buttermilk, and I'm going to make a little well here in the middle, and I'm just going to pour this in. And this is a pretty sticky batter, so you'll as you'll mix it together, and I'm just going to use the spoon initially just to mix this around, but it will be a little bit on the stickier side, which is great. I mean, that helps. We don't want it to be too dry when we're starting out and making the loaf, because we do want that moisture in there. Whenever you're using a whole grain or whole wheat flour, whole grain flours will really absorb the liquid. So you want to make sure that there's enough there so that the end product doesn't get too dry. And if if I feel like I need a little bit more buttermilk, I might add some, but I think this is actually pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're just going to turn this out onto the surface. And when making this kind of a bread, because the buttermilk and the baking soda are creating that chemical reaction, which is going to give it the rise, you don't want to wait too long as far as trying to get this in the oven. So I'm just going to put a little bit of flour here on my counter, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to turn it all out onto the counter. Just so I want to just bring this together into like a little bit of a ball, round. So we're just gonna, I'm not really kneading it. You don't really need to knead it. We really just kind of want the flour just to be and the buttermilk to sort of kind of come together. This could be a really great bread for kids because it's fast, it's easy, there's very few ingredients. They would love to do this little bit of kneading. And it's kind of like, again, it's sort of like a food science experiment. You can talk to them a little bit about the difference between using yeast in bread and not using yeast. And, if they've ever made volcanoes, that interaction of vinegar and baking soda that causes the volcanoes to erupt. That's the same thing that's sort of happening here, although we're not using vinegar. We're using buttermilk that's giving it the acidity. Okay. So you can see this is a really soft dough. It's sticking to my hands, which is really what you want. I'm trying to see if I can incorporate most of these little flour crumbs that are sort of falling off. And I can feel the moisture now. I can feel that the buttermilk is really being absorbed into the flour because it's becoming less dry. It's becoming a little bit more sticky. All right, so once you have it, I don't know if I'm going to be able to incorporate all of this, but that's okay. So once you have it comes together and you feel like you can pretty much make a nice little ball. It can be a little bit craggly. It doesn't have to be. There could be some little spots that are breaking open a little bit. That's fine. So then I'm going to bring it over and we're going to put it on just a lined baking sheet. Let me bring this back over and let me just clear this off so I don't have any of this on the bottom of my baking sheet. So that would burn in the oven. All right, I'll try to get some of this off my hands. Okay, so now we have the shape that we want, a little round, kind of flat, slightly dome shape. Now we want to cut it, and that's what gives it that traditional look. And you do want to cut pretty far into the bread. So you're not cutting all the way through to the bottom of it, but you're making a pretty decent sized depth of a little bit of a cut through the bread, and so it separates. And I'll show you that finished product again just to see how it looks and it does. And then I would just take a little bit of flour, some of the whole grain flour, and just sprinkle it on top. And that's it. That's it. This bread is ready to go. So this is going to go in the oven for I have a 375 degree oven. It's going to go in for about 30 minutes, and that's really all it takes. You kind of want to check it. I just turned it halfway through so that, because it was browning a little bit more in the back of the oven, so I just turned the tray. And it did take 30 minutes. You can kind of tap on it, and if it sort of sounds a little bit hollow, then you know it's pretty well done. All right, so let's just look at this finished product. So you can see, because of the way I cut that, it really opens up. It just looks so cool. And we'll cut it. Now, traditionally, Irish soda bread is served probably with really good rich Irish butter. But I was thinking, rather than just from a, just from a heart health, it still tastes great. Maybe use the butter, that's fine. But if you want something a little bit healthier, then my son and daughter-in-law gifted this to me. This is a Graza Drizzle extra virgin olive oil. Oh my gosh, it is absolutely amazing. My husband and I have been putting it on everything. So I would use this maybe and just take a little drizzle, and look how green that olive oil is. Maybe a little bit, something a little bit not traditional, which would typically be butter, but certainly a little bit more heart healthy, is to drizzle it with a little bit of olive oil. So you can see this has a really nice dense crumb. This would be fantastic toasted, obviously. If you're not going to eat it the same day you bake it, then I think it's probably really good toasted. The other thing that I would do is I would probably double this. If I'm going to make one, I might as well make two, maybe even 3 loaves, because it's so easy and the oven's already on. Then then freeze it. Good to go. You could either slice it and freeze it or just freeze the whole loaf. All right, so I hope you try this. I know that we have St. Patrick's Day coming up, so this might be a nice addition if you're doing anything special for that day. Don't wait just for St. Patrick's Day, though, to make Irish soda bread. This is just an easy bread that you could be making all year long. Stay well, eat well, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.